Hello, and welcome to the first of the 2023 Year 8 QDU Academy sessions. Today, we're going to be looking at the topic that we should only eat foods grown in Australia. In this video, we're going to go over a few things that are important for this debate. We're going to start by looking at what questions you should ask yourselves in the context of this debate, and what research you should do beforehand to understand the topic better. Then we're going to look at setup, sort of how you define and how you introduce models for the topic. Then we're going to get on to brainstorming points, a bit of structure, and lastly, go through some questions that were asked in the Zoom call for this session earlier this week. The first thing to do when approaching any long prep debate is to look at the context of the debate which will be taking place. This means gaining a good background knowledge of a few important pieces of information about what the status quo looks like about the issue being debated. There are a few things that I think in this particular debate it's important to have a good understanding of. The first is to have a good understanding of how much food and what types of food are grown in Australia already. I think it's very easy to underestimate how much food is already grown in Australia. Obviously, in Queensland, we have a very hot and humid climate that's very good for growing some types of food, but can be very difficult to grow other types of food. It's worth knowing what types of food are grown close to Queensland, but also that other parts of Australia have very different climates. For example, Tasmania has a far more temperate climate. It's a lot less hot and a lot less humid. That means that there's lots of types of food that are grown in Queensland that would be bad to grow in Tasmania, but are grown in Tasmania but would be bad to grow in Queensland. Consider that Australia is very big and has lots of different climates when looking at how much food is currently grown. Another thing to look at is what types of food Australia currently imports or exports. The food that Australia imports is the food that is either grown or made in other countries and is then brought to Australia. Exporting is food that is grown in Australia and is sent to other places. Usually, the food that countries will export is their excess after after all of the food of that type that people in that country want has already been taken. But sometimes it might be the case that Australia, by being quite wealthy, is able to import food before that food gets to some people that already live in other countries. It's worth knowing both how much and also what types of food this currently takes place with. A key example of this, and one that you may have seen in the news over the past couple of years, is the idea of live animal exports. That's when Australia sends livestock, such as sheep or cows, overseas, and they are still alive on that trip, but they will eventually be killed to eat. You might want to look at that from both a practical or a moral standpoint as to if that is good and if that is worth changing. The final thing to look at is the economics of the thing above. That is to say that some countries will make money off the food that they export because they export more than they import, and that could carry economic benefits that allow them to put money elsewhere in the economy. It's worth knowing whether Australia currently makes a net profit or a net loss from its food imports or exports, and think about whether that's likely to change within the context of this debate. If we're currently making a profit, are we likely to make less money because we're eating only food grown in Australia and therefore exporting less, or more money because we're importing less as well? It's important to have an understanding of how that might change in the debate and do some research to know what the status. We're now going to move on to discussing setup for this debate. The first thing to do in setup is to define the key words within the topic. You should look at the topic and identify words that you think are important to this motion, and make sure that you define them to make it very clear what you are debating about. I've included a few words below that I think are quite important for this topic. One of them is food. I think food is largely an uncontroversial word, as in both teams are going to agree on the definition of it, but it's still very important to the topic. It would be a very different debate, for example, if the topic was that we should only wear clothes grown in Australia. So the fact that the debate is about food is important, so you should define it. The next word to look at is the word only. The word only I think is quite important because it is a very absolute word. It sort of suggests that there should be no exceptions. You should look into that if you're the affirmative team and make sure that you define that word quite clearly to make sure it doesn't become messy. The third word is the word grown. When we did the online session for this topic, a student asked about the word grown because there was a bit of uncertainty about what it meant. For example, some people thought that grown specifically referred to animals and plants, and not, for example, to processed foods. However, some people viewed the topic referred to only eating food sort of made in Australia. Make sure you're very certain of whether you believe the word grown specifically refers to it growing in the ground or growing as an animal, or if grown just more broadly refers to made. In my opinion, I think it makes more sense to define the word grown in a more general sense, because I think it probably minimizes impact of other arguments if you create exceptions. However, you may disagree, and I think it's a valid definition to view it in the other way. The final word that I think is important, and unfortunately I've misspelt it on this PowerPoint, is the word Australia. Just be very careful that you be careful to appreciate that this topic refers to Australia as a whole, and when defining it, make sure that you make that clear. The next piece of setup to look at are models and countermodels. The model is the affirmative team's way of showing how and what they are going to change about the status quo. That means that if this topic is that we should only eat food grown in Australia, they should explain how we will only eat food grown in Australia. For example, you may believe that we should ban other food. Or maybe you believe that we do not need to ban it, it should just be that everyone individually chooses to only eat food grown in Australia. Make sure that you make your model quite clear. There was a bit of a discussion in the online session about the merits of two different types of models. These are broadly referred to as a hardline or a softline model. A hardline model is one that is very definite and absolute. It will use very definite language, such as only or banning, and it won't create exceptions to itself. For example, a hardline model in this debate from affirmative would not say that processed foods are not part of the debate. A softline model is one where you create exceptions. It's when you say that this should be a general rule, but in some circumstances, other things make sense. This is a bit circumstantial. Sometimes it will make a lot of sense that there should be an exception to a rule in a certain debate, because it would be silly to not accept it. However, I would encourage that in most cases, it makes more sense to use a hardline model, because for a couple of reasons. The big one is that it limits your risk of contradicting yourself, because if you keep on saying that a certain thing is good or bad, but that there are some circumstances where it is not, then that means that you risk a contradiction. It also may weaken your arguments. For example, if in this debate you were talking about the economic benefits to Australian small businesses from only eating food grown in Australia, it would make your argument weaker to say that you could still eat some food that was grown elsewhere. However, you may believe that there is some difficulty growing some food in Australia that means that it's important to have some exceptions to the rule. I think this is a choice that you should make in your teams, but it's one you should be very conscious of the fact that you are making, because it will change your arguments. Looking at countermodels, countermodels are what the negative team will use. Now, a negative team does not always need to run a countermodel. A good rule of thumb of knowing if you should run a countermodel is to think about the problem that the debate is trying to solve. There are a couple of different approaches that a negative team can take. One of them is to agree that there is a problem and say that there are better ways to solve it than the way that the affirmative team is saying. And another one is to say that actually there is not a problem and that the affirmative team is overcomplicating a scenario that works perfectly well under the status quo. If you think that there is a problem that this debate is trying to solve, and it's a problem that you as a negative team agree is worth solving, it's often worthwhile to therefore run a countermodel and to say that there are better ways to fix it, because otherwise you would be agreeing that there was a problem but not offering a solution. However, if you are of the mind that you are going to disagree that a problem exists and say that the status quo works fine, it's often inadvisable to run a countermodel because it will make the debate a bit more complicated and will take up time from your speeches to explain when it won't be key to your case. The important thing to remember about models and countermodels is that debating is a comparative exercise. That means that if you are the affirmative team and you've spent a lot of time at first affirmative proving that the current scenario is bad, if the negative team agrees that the current scenario is bad and introduces a countermodel, make sure that all of your arguments are reframed to be a clear comparison between your solution and the negative team solution, rather than between your solution and the status quo, because the negative team would no longer be supporting it. Likewise, if you're the negative team, listen very carefully to the affirmative team's model and make sure that any of your criticisms about it are about very specifically what is said and not about what you imagined that it might be beforehand or with the status quo. Having completed setup, the next thing to look at when developing your case is to brainstorm your point ideas. This might be a good moment to pause the video and start to think about what ideas you can have. In this video, I'm not going to be giving you ideas of what specifically your points should be, but I will suggest a few directions that it might be important to think about in terms of certain impacts that this debate might have, and things that I think that both teams could argue and have good points about. For example, you could look at whether there would be health benefits to eating food only grown in Australia. This is something you could approach from both sides. The affirmative team might argue that it is more healthy to eat food grown in Australia, or the negative team might argue that it is less healthy. But having healthy food is probably a good thing, so having an argument that proves that you get healthier food is likewise probably good. Similarly, both teams could run arguments about the economic effects, and whether Australia would be able to make more money off food that is grown in Australia if we only eat food grown in Australia, or if we could cost ourselves less money from importing food if we were importing less of it. Again, I'm not going to tell you how to make that argument from start to finish, but I would encourage you to think about that as a particular thing that might be interesting to look at within the debate. Similarly, you may be looking at moral arguments in this debate. You might wonder, do we have a moral obligation to only eat food grown in Australia and help Australian people that grow Australian food? On the affirmative, you might believe that we do, and on the negative team, you might believe that we don't. There are good ways of proving this on both sides, but I'll allow you to step that out, but I'll give you the prompt to think about that as a possible thing that you could make an argument about. The key notes on the board I think are quite important. Consider who are the different stakeholders that we should care about in this debate. There are probably a number of them. There may be governments that are making policies. There may be people that are growing food. There may be people that are buying food. And there may be people that are eating food. Have a think about what each of these groups looks like, and what they want, and what their motivations are, and how this policy might change their behavior. And this could help you develop very fleshed out points that have quite a bit of nuance. Once you've brainstormed a point, and you think it could be quite persuasive, and you've done some good research to make sure that you have some background information that allows you to back up your point and make it quite persuasively, we'll then look at structuring your argument once you've got that far. Often some of the best structures to use in debating are similar to ones that you may have encountered when writing persuasive arguments in class. There are many different acronyms that different schools will use for this, but a general structure that is often followed is the idea that you present a point, you give evidence to support it, you explain it and give reasons, and then you link it back to the very start. I'll have a go at explaining what each of these things looks like within a debate. The first step is to establish your point. This should be a very short sentence, which establishes the key parts of your point and why your point means that you win the debate. Make sure it sounds very important and not some very vague idea. The second thing is to give explanation for it. This looks like giving reasons why your argument is true. If, for example, you say it would be better for the economy to only eat food grown in Australia, give reasons for that. Explain it in logical terms. Once you've explained it in logical terms, give evidence and examples to make your point feel very real and tied to the real world. In the online session, we had a few questions about how many examples and how many statistics are often useful to use in arguments. I think the key to statistics is that they should be used to back up your logic rather than be a replacement for logic itself. The most important thing to do is prove that your scenario is likely to be the most likely one. Giving evidence and examples afterwards establishes that not just does your thing logically make sense, but is reflected in the real world. However, if you only give a statistic, there is probably a reason why that statistic is true, and so it makes sense to also give the reason behind the statistic. If it is just the statistic and nothing else, you often end up in an uncomfortable situation where both teams have statistics that contradict each other, that say different things, and the adjudicator doesn't know which one to believe. So make sure that you also have logic that means that your statistic is not just true, but is also likely to reflect broader trends and is the most probable outcome. The last thing to do is to link your argument back to the topic. This means establishing why the impact that you say, for example, that either only eating food grown in Australia or not eating food grown in Australia would be better for the economy, and that means that we should or should not only eat food grown in Australia. Link all of your arguments back to the topic to make sure that they're very relevant at the end of your points. The final thing that we looked at in the online session was looking at rebuttal. This was more so in the context of how to do rebuttal in general than specifically about this particular debate. And so, if you feel as if you are already confident in rebuttal, you probably don't need to listen to far much more of it. But if you feel that you lack some confidence with rebuttal or don't know exactly how to do it, at this point, I'll continue to explain it as sort of a recap or an introduction to rebuttal as a debating concept if you haven't encountered it before. The important thing in rebuttal is that you're trying to persuade the adjudicator that what the other team has said does not mean that they should win the debate. That means that you want to be doing one of a couple of things. One of them is proving that the opposition's arguments are wrong, because if the other team's arguments are incorrect, then the adjudicator should not award them the win. So try and always say no as much as possible in your rebuttal, rather than saying things like yes, but, or yes, and. Because this means that you might concede some things and the adjudicator may still believe the other team's arguments. The other thing that's important to do in rebuttal is try and persuade the adjudicator that the opposition's material is unimportant. This is useful because sometimes, even if you try and prove that the opposition are wrong, they may have very well-structured arguments that are difficult to wholly disprove. So it's useful to also persuade the adjudicator that even if the argument is true, it is not important enough. It might be that it is not important by itself, or it might be that it's less important than the arguments that you bring up. So make sure that you prove those kind of things to make sure that the other team's arguments seem less persuasive and less debate-winning. We had some questions in the online session about how much rebuttal to do at each speaker. I think the important thing to do is make sure that you have a bit of rebuttal at each speaker. First negatives and second affirmatives should try and have at least one piece of rebuttal to each of the 2 points of substantive that the speaker before them has mentioned. However, they obviously both have a lot of substantive to get through themselves, so it's okay if the substantive is the more important and the more time-consuming part of your point. In fact, at first negative, I'd often advise to have 2 pieces of rebuttal, but probably keep them quite short, because the most important thing is your own arguments. At speakers like second negative, you still have substantive, but it's probably less important substantive than the material at your first speaker. So it means that you can spend a bit more time on rebuttal, probably about half of your speech, and try and give rebuttals to both the second speaker's points from the affirmative team, and also, if you feel as if you have new responses, also respond to the first affirmative speaker to make sure that you keep on bringing up the reasons why that team is wrong. As a third speaker, you should be spending most of your time rebutting in the debate. It's often a good idea to try and have at least one piece of rebuttal to all of the 4 arguments that the other team has brought up, and possibly even to have other rebuttals to superfluous things, or rebut the other team's rebuttals to your team. This is important because your summary is still important as a third speaker, but it's unlikely to change the adjudicator's mind. By the summary of the third speaker, the adjudicator probably already agrees with your team's arguments or is already convinced that your team's arguments are wrong, and merely giving a summary that explains them the same way as your earlier speakers probably won't change the adjudicator's mind. So make sure that you spend most of your time actively disproving the other team's arguments, and I think that works at both third affirmative and third negative speaker. Summaries are good for structure, and they give you something to hold on to at the end of your speech, or if you feel as if you've run out of rebuttal and you need something to say. But try and avoid them being the focal point. Make sure that most of your speech is still rebuttal. The last couple of things to point out are, if you're watching this video, you've probably already found the Queensland Debating Union YouTube channel. However, it's still important to keep an eye on it, because there will be videos updated about all of the long prep debates throughout the season. And there are also some other useful advice on it about different types of debate and different debating contexts. So it's important to have an idea of where that YouTube channel is and keep an eye on it for useful content. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching this video. I wish you all the best of luck for this debate and for the rest of your season.